If the Repulsor and Repulsor Executioner aren't quite big enough floating hover death machines for you, then maybe you need an Astraeus in your life. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where we're dedicated to getting the most out of your miniatures on the tabletop. And we've been going through the Space Marine Codex unit by unit, and datasheet by datasheet. Now I was requested to do the Astraeus super heavy tank quite a long time ago, but between Night Fortnight and all of the other unit reviews we've been doing, it's been a bit delayed, but now we've got time to look at it. In this video we'll be looking at the unit's rules, any obvious synergies or strategies that we can use to get the most out of it, and how I would run one on the battlefield myself. In the background, the Astraeus is a super heavy grav tank exclusively used by the primaris Space Marines. It blends Archmagus Belisarius cores, innovations with anti-grav technology, with far older STC designs, and its manufacture and construction is limited to the more distant forge worlds, far from Mars's prying gaze. The tank itself is armed with weapons of terrific power, and is protected by layered void shields to deflect incoming energy weapons from its hull. The kit itself is quite cool looking, which frankly it has to be, as Forge World will charge you a mere £231 for this thing. Though the way Games Workshop's prices are going these days, that's still not too bad an investment in terms of money per points. Yes, I'm looking at you, Orc Smasher Guns, who cost £1 per point. Anyway, mild deviation, let's take a look at this thing's datasheet. So the Astraeus Super Heavy Tank is of course a Lord of War choice for Codex Space Marines and will set you back 705 points at its base loadout. For that mighty investment you get a decent profile. When it's not bracketed, it's movement 12, weapon skill 5 up, ballistic skill 3 up, strength 9, toughness 8, 24 wounds, 8 attacks, leadership 9 and a 2 up save. It is further protected by void shields, which sort of act as a invulnerable save that degrades with the vehicle's profile. When it has at least 11 wounds remaining, you'll be saving on a 5+, and you can also take those saves against mortal wounds, so a little bit better than an invul save. However, unlike an invul save, this will degrade when you get to 10 wounds, so you'll only save on a 6+, and then it becomes irrelevant when you only have 5 wounds remaining, when you'll be saving on a 7+. The vehicle's profile also degrades at these brackets, which are quite good brackets considering, seeing as you have to degrade to 10 wounds before you drop a profile, so that's well less than half. Its movement drops to 9 when it's got 10 wounds or less, and its ballistic skill to 4+, and when it's 5 wounds or less, you'll be only moving 5 inches and hitting on a 5+. This thing is armed with a number of decent guns. In terms of small arms, it's got a twin heavy bolter, a storm bolter, and an Iron Hail heavy stubber. In terms of main armament, it's got 2 Las Rippers and a twin macro accelerator cannon. So overall, for such a pricey model, it doesn't actually have that great a defensive stat line. Essentially the same as an Imperial Knight with a 2-up save, but with no ability to rotate ion shields. So it's going to be important how much firepower it can kick out with these exotic weapons. Let's look at the macro accelerator cannon first. This is the weapon that it can't swap out, and oh boy does it pack a punch. The macro accelerator cannon has a 72-inch range, is a mighty heavy 12, strength 8, AP-2 and damage 3. Furthermore, when it targets an enemy with the fly keyword, it ignores any abilities that give it a -1 to hit. Now this is a ludicrously strong weapon. It's essentially like firing the Imperial Guard's relic battle cannon, Hammer of Sunderance, and automatically rolling a 6 for the number of shots. From experience, I know how good that thing can be. I've had it one-shot an entire unit of tower broadsides, and automatically getting 12 shots per turn is just a crazy amount of firepower. This thing will happily put an entire ton of damage on whatever you target it at. Even completely unbuffed, this thing is worth an average of 8 damage per turn on an Imperial Knight, and believe me, if you're running an enormous tank like the Astraeus, you're going to be utilising some of the Space Marines' enormous amount of buffs on it. So that's a very strong weapon indeed, efficient against pretty much any targets. The twin Las Rippers that it has are 24-inch range heavy 2 guns, strength 8, AP-3 and flat damage 3. So they're reasonably similar to having an extra 4 multi-melters on the tank. So that's another whack of decent firepower, but it is a little bit restrictive in that the range is so short, meaning you'll be wanting to try and put your super heavy tank a bit closer to the enemy, which might put it in harm's way of enemy melee or close range guns. You can swap these Las Rippers out for plasma eradicators, and you'll actually save 10 points by doing so. The plasma eradicators have a 36-inch range. They're heavy D3 shots with a strength of 8, AP -4 and damage 1, and if you supercharge them, they gain 1 point of strength and 1 point of damage, and as per normal, for each hit roll of 1, the bearer suffers a mortal wound. So these things are pretty much akin to big plasma cannons with an extra point of strength and an extra point of AP. They won't be quite as good against tanks as your Las Rippers, but they will be better against primaris infantry, or anything with flat 2 wounds. The tank also comes equipped with an enhanced repulsor field, which is a melee weapon, which I think quite adequately shows the damage it can do by crushing enemy infantry under its repulsor field. This is strength user, AP -2 and damage D3, so that'll be strength 9, but it'll only hit on a 5+, so you can expect to have 2 or 3 hits per turn with this weapon. It's nowhere near as strong as an Imperial Knight's stomp attacks, but it is good for a few extra random wounds on enemies who presume to try and take your tank out in close combat. The model has a few additional options. You can trade out those twin heavy bolters for twin las cannons. I'd say that this is a take or leave type option. You are stacking more guns on an already very expensive platform that's not that tough, but if you're running an Astraeus, then you're likely to be stacking an enormous amount of buffs on it, so you'll be getting a lot of value out of any guns that you do put on it. So if you want a little bit of extra anti-armour, I don't see why not. Twin las cannons are fairly efficient points-wise. Its final option is that you can take an additional Iron Hail heavy stubber, which I think is quite funny really. It's not really going to make much difference to this massive armoured behemoth whether it has one additional Iron Hail heavy stubber, but for what it's worth, seeing as you're likely to be buffing it up, I would take this. A few extra decent anti-infantry shots for 6 points never hurts. The Astraeus has a whole ton of special rules. Much like the Repulsor, it has Power of the Machine Spirit, so it ignores penalties for moving and shooting with the heavy weapons. It has the Hover Tank special rule, which means that you measure distances from either the model's base or the model's hull, whichever is closer. It has an upgraded version of the repulsor fields that regular repulsors have. Your opponent must subtract 3 from any charge roll made when you're charging this unit, which is quite interesting because if you're coming in from reserve and must set up greater than 9 inches away, it means that your opponent's reserving charges can only ever succeed on a double 6, presuming there are no modifiers or other things going on. That's actually pretty decent protection against melee, and could really help this thing from being hit in close combat unless literally the enemy is right next door. It has the Steel Behemoth rule, which means it can fall back and still charge during the player's turn, and of course because it has the Fly special rule, it can fall back and still shoot all of its weapons. If it wants to stay in combat, it can also fire its weapons when there are enemies within 1 inch of it, so if there are any enemy units that don't want to be in combat nearby it, then it should typically charge them, and it still won't have any impacts to its shooting. This could be quite powerful, as if there was any way that you could prevent the enemy unit from falling back, say try pointing them with another unit or surrounding them in scouts or something. You could potentially have an Astraeus which is immune to being shot, because it's in combat, but can still fire out of combat, provided you can lock an enemy unit there for a turn or so. So that's potentially quite a powerful rule. It has the Explode special rule, where if you roll a 6, then any units within 2d6 inches take d6 mortal wounds. So it's worth saving a command point for if it goes down in the middle of your army to re-roll that unlucky 6 result when it explodes, as otherwise you risk losing a good chunk of your army if and when it goes down. It has those Void Shields, which we've already discussed, and as per the Forge World FAQ, it has the Angels of Death special rule, which is most important for giving it access to combat doctrines. Obviously this thing is going to love the Devastator doctrine, when that enormous twin macro accelerator cannon will be getting AP -3, and chewing through armoured targets like there's no tomorrow. So overall, the Astraeus is an enormous unit with a very high damage output, mainly concentrated in that twin macro accelerator cannon. It's quite flexible, able to move fast and shoot on the move, is protected from close combat to some extent with those repulsor fields, and has a big advantage over Imperial Knights, has access to all of the very nice Space Marine buffs, which we'll talk about now. So how can we improve and augment the Astraeus' formidable abilities to make it a game-winning piece on the tabletop? First, let's take a look at the different chapter traits that we can use to help it. Obviously, as with any vehicle, Iron Hands is a solid trait. A 6-up Feel No Pain will certainly help keep it alive for longer, and helps counteract its relatively weak defense point for point. Decent Overwatch is certainly helpful when you've got such a big scary gun as that macro accelerator cannon, and degrading slower is a nice bonus as well. Rerolling ones with heavy weapons is great, though I think most chapters would typically be buying a captain or a chapter master to put by this thing, so it might be a bit redundant, and of course it already has the power of the machine spirit so it can move and shoot normally anyway. Some other tricks from the Iron Hand include the Iron Stone. This is an absolutely awesome target for that relic, making it incredibly obnoxious to shift from the battlefield. -1 to incoming damage is an upgrade that Imperial Knights can only dream of. Iron Father Phyros also synergizes very well with this thing. His Signum Array will give it a 2-up to hit regardless of how much damage it's taken, and a flat 3 repair per turn is pretty handy. If you're not taking Phyros, then the Iron Hand's power to make it hit on a 2-up is great, and if you do want to focus fire with this thing, then the No Mercy stratagem is amazing. Getting double the wounds for every 6 could potentially augment your firepower by quite a bit. Just to say that basically any stratagem or buff that you put on this thing will be very high value. Typically stratagems and unit buffs are considered from buffing a normal sized unit's perspective, so if you can use the same things on an absolutely enormous unit, then you'll get far more value out of them. Raven Guard or the Stealthy Chapter Tactic are other strong choices. Having a 1-up save effectively from being in cover all the time is very helpful, and the +1 to hit and wound against characters could certainly help it gun down some knights with contemptuous ease. Salamanders could be useful against AP-1 weapons, though Master Artisans doesn't have quite as much effect on such a high rate of fire weapon. Salamanders are particularly good for some of their stratagems and psychic powers. Crucible of Battle to give this thing +1 to wound is just a ludicrous damage buff. That accelerator cannon will be wounding knights on 3s and toughness 7 vehicles on 2s, which is very scary indeed. Their powers of Fire Shield and Drakeskin could give this thing a -1 to hit and toughness 9, which would really help counteract its relatively lackluster defensive profile point for point. Salamanders is certainly a strong pick with the Astraeus. Imperial Fists or Crimson Fists is also solid. Ignores cover is certainly a solid bonus from the Imperial Fists, and getting +1 damage on all weapons against vehicles will certainly help ramp up that accelerator cannon to insane levels of damage. Again, any specific stratagems can be very useful on this thing, particularly the Tank Hunter stratagem to give it +1 to wound against vehicles, with a combination of +1 to wound and a flat damage 4 from the Imperial Fist Doctrine. The accelerator cannon alone will on average down a knight with a 5+ invul save when he is next to Tor Garadon with his Signum Array, and a lieutenant for reroll 1s to wound. Against vehicles, Imperial Fists really do up this thing to apocalyptic levels of damage. As just mentioned, Tor Garadon also has good synergy with him because of that Signum Array, giving him a very nice ballistic skill of 2+. Ultramarines have numerous good buffing characters. Calgar or Gilliman will be giving this thing all the rerolls it needs. Tigurius could be giving it -1 to hit with his prescience power, and Chaplain Cassius could be giving it the benefit of 2 litanies per turn, probably the +1 to hit and +1 to wound the nearest unit buffs. Other Ultramarines tricks such as redeploying the unit turn 1 with a stratagem could be very powerful, and give this thing lines of sight or opportunities that your opponent would not expect. Also the Seal of Oath relic, I believe it is, could give this Astraeus 4 rerolls to hit and wound against a select target, which is pretty mental, as that twin accelerator autocannon basically will happily kill anything. As we've already alluded to a little, having such an enormously sized unit means that you'll get great value out of putting character support on it. Captains, chapter masters and lieutenants will all give it needed rerolls to get the most out of that enormous gun. Chaplain listeners also have a great effect on this, particularly giving it +1 to hit, and also potentially the +1 to wound litany, though this is a bit situational as to whether or not it wants to be shooting its closest target. Librarians also not one to overlook. as giving this thing Might of Heroes will make it toughness 9, and toughness 9 with a 2-up save and a 5+ void shield save certainly isn't going anywhere fast. It's quite an important bracket to be in, because it means that even strength 8 weapons will be needing a 5+ to wound, and las cannons will be needing a 4-up. Tech Marines will also be able to repair it, and 45 points for a few extra wounds of a incredibly pricey tank could well be worth it in the end. Let's look at stratagems now. We've already mentioned a bunch of these supplement-specific stratagems, but any stratagem that we can use on it is likely to have great value as it's such a huge unit. If you are about to take a bunch of mortal wounds, then Armour of Contempt could keep it safe, as between that and its void shields, it will have 2 5-up saves to fail before it takes any damage from mortal wounds. Most of the other core Space Marine book stratagems don't apply due to keyword restrictions, but essentially anything that can enhance its durability or damage output that you can use on an Astraeus out of any of the supplement codexes is likely to be great value due to the size of the thing. So now we've considered a lot of the ways to buff the unit. How would I field one on the battlefield? Personally, I would take the Iron Hell Heavy Stubber. I slightly prefer the Las Rippers to the Plasma Eradicators due to them having such a high damage output, and I think that this outweighs the shorter range. You get the same number of shots, so I think that I'd prefer to pay the small amount of extra points to make them damage 3 shots that don't have any chance of causing yourself mortal wounds on such an expensive tank. But I don't really see anything too bad with the Plasma Eradicators. I do think it's quite a close call. As I'd be planning to layer so many buffs on this thing, I would probably take the other small upgrade to give it the twin las cannon instead of the twin heavy bolters, as twin las cannons are really quite good value, and only a bit over 20 points more than the heavy bolters are. That would put my build for the Astraeus at 724 points. From there, I'd strongly want to consider what sort of units I'd like to bring to support it. I'd be very keen to bring along anything that could increase the unit's durability, whether that's the Ironstone in Iron Hands, Tigurius from Ultramarines, or a Salamander's Librarian with Fire Shield. I'd also strongly consider a generic Librarian with Might of Heroes to make that toughness a almighty 9. I'd certainly take a Lieutenant, then I'd take either a Chaplain and Captain, or a Chapter Master to ensure that almost all of the shots are hitting home. Depending on my opponent, I would play this unit quite differently. Certainly if they have short-ranged anti-tank weapons, I'd be looking to outrange them for the first turn or two, and sit back taking pot shots with the Macro Accelerator Cannon and Twin Las Cannons, and maybe saving those Las Rippers for if the enemy closes. If the enemy has oodles of long-range firepower, then it might actually be worth sending the Astraeus up towards the enemy to try and charge enemy units and tie them up, as you'll be getting some more damage output from close combat, as well as blazing away at them at all times with its heavy firepower. If you can see any way to stop an enemy unit from falling back while the tank is in close combat with them, then you might just buy yourself a turn of your very expensive tank being completely immune to enemy firepower, which would be very nice indeed. Above all, you need to make sure that this thing survives for most of the game, as if you bring a 700+ point unit and it gets shot down either turn 1 or turn 2, then you might well have just lost the game in one fell swoop, because you'll be fighting a much superior foe after losing over a third of your points for little return. If the enemy has heavy melee threats, you'd be wanting to keep the Astraeus safe from being hit to death by anything that's too strong. It should be largely protected from deep strikers by that -3 to charge penalty, but it certainly needs to hover a certain distance away to make sure those charges are incredibly hard to achieve. In terms of support from the rest of the army, you should probably consider a fair amount of infantry to hold objectives, and ways to shoot things that you can't see because they're hiding in ruins, say whirlwinds or thunderfire cannons, or flyers perhaps, so you can swoop in behind ruins and clear enemy infantry. Until any seriously scary melee threats are removed, you can't really afford to advance your Astraeus into the thick of the fighting, so it'll be up to these units to win the objective game. So how does the Astraeus stack up when compared with the competition? In terms of raw firepower and the amount of wounds it has, it doesn't compare particularly favourably when compared with, say, 2 Repulse Executioners, which cost a little bit less than it does. If they're armed with heavy laser destroyers, they'll typically outperform it against heavy armour, say Leman Rosses or Knights, and in general they'll be able to hoover up more infantry as well, with their numerous secondary armaments. The main advantage of the Astraeus over these guys is that it has an invul save, which can seriously help protect it against the heaviest incoming anti-tank fire, and that it is a single model. The fact that it's a single model means that you can absolutely stack all of your buffs on one unit and have them pay off enormously. So I think with the Astraeus you're basically playing high risk, high reward. You can get an enormous amount of firepower out of it if you do manage to keep it alive and stack an enormous amount of buffs to ramp up that firepower to silly levels. But if your opponent does get lucky and somehow manages to take it out early, then it could be a lot of points down the drain, particularly when you count into all of the support that you've probably bought for it. So overall, on a competitive level, I'd say the Astraeus is a high risk, high reward unit. It is pretty fragile for the amount of points that you invest in it, but it is possibly the single best Space Marine unit in terms of stacking a silly amount of buffs in one model, and that can lead it to being incredibly efficient when all the pieces are in motion. On a purely competitive level, it probably doesn't stack up amazingly against, say, 2 Repulsor Executioners, or a Knight Castellan, which fulfills a very similar battlefield role, but it is certainly an incredibly destructive force to be reckoned with, and if played right, could certainly carve a merry way through your opponent's army. Thanks very much for listening to another Auspex Tactics review. If you have any insight on the Astraeus, please feel free to leave it in the comments down below for us all to benefit. And if I've made any rules errors, then please point them out too. I always feel it's a little bit more of a risk when you're dealing with Forge World units that have had a few rules changes over the edition so far. Feel free to subscribe if you'd like to see more content like this, or to support me on Patreon if you'd like to say thank you for all of the hours it takes to make these videos. Again, thanks for watching, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.